I remember the exact moment I understood that death would have been a mercy. It was the 17th day of my captivity. I had been keeping count by the cycles of artificial light in what I later learned the Orks called their mech shop, when I realized they were never going to kill me. Not quickly, at least. Not cleanly. Not in any way that would allow me to die with the dignity I had spent 37 years of service earning. The bolt round that should have ended me in that trench had instead merely grazed my skull, and when I woke in darkness with my hands bound behind my back and the stench of fungal growth thick in my nostrils, I had assumed my execution was imminent. Orks did not take prisoners. Every training manual, every tactical briefing, every whispered warning from veterans who had faced the greenskin menace emphasized this fundamental truth. Orks killed. They killed quickly, joyfully, wastefully. They did not capture. They did not interrogate. They certainly did not keep humans alive in cages made from salvaged Imperial vehicles, welded together with apparent disregard for structural integrity. Yet there I was. The first 3 days had been the worst in ways I could never have anticipated. Not because of torture, there was none, at least not in any methodical sense, but because of the noise. The Orks were never silent. Never. Even in what I assumed were their sleeping hours. The camp echoed with guttural snores, random bursts of violence, as one greenskin punched another in its sleep, and the constant background hum of badly maintained machinery that threatened to explode at any moment, but somehow never did. I had been trained to withstand interrogation, to resist psychological manipulation, to maintain composure under physical duress. I had not been trained to endure the ceaseless, chaotic cacophony of Ork existence. It was not torture in the refined sense, it was simply their nature, as fundamental to them as breathing was to humans. They were loud because silence was foreign to their biology, as alien to them as their guttural language was to my ears. My cage hung suspended from a massive crane arm that swayed with every impact that shook the camp, which was frequent. Orks, I quickly learned, resolved disputes through violence the way humans might resolve them through discussion. An argument over who owned a particular piece of scrap metal would inevitably conclude with one Ork punching the other until the matter was settled. The loser would shake his head, make a sound that might have been laughter or acknowledgement. It was difficult to tell, and the winner would claim his prize. Then, often as not, they would both resume whatever they had been doing before the disagreement, apparently bearing no grudge. It was efficient in its brutality, and I found myself thinking thoughts that a Commissar should never think, that perhaps there was a terrible honesty to such a system. I dismissed the thought immediately. Such thinking was dangerous. I was Commissar Marcos Venn, attached to the Hadrian 44th Infantry Regiment, and I had executed men for less treasonous ideation. The Imperium's way was the only way, refined through 10,000 years of human survival in a galaxy that wanted us dead. The Orks were Zenos filth, and any thought that suggested otherwise was corruption that needed to be burned out before it took root. But the thoughts kept coming anyway, unwelcome and persistent, as the fungal smell that permeated everything in the camp. On the 4th day, one of them brought me water. Not clean water, nothing in an Ork camp was clean, but water nonetheless, sloshing in a dented Imperial canteen that still bore the regimental markings of the Cadian 8th. The Ork thrust it through the bars of my cage with no ceremony, grunting something in its barbaric tongue. When I hesitated, suspicious of poison, it made a sound that I can only describe as exasperation, took a gulp from the canteen itself, then thrust it at me again. I drank. I had no choice. Dehydration would kill me faster than whatever disease might lurk in the greenskin's saliva, and I had not survived 3 decades of Imperial service by being too proud to do what survival demanded. The Ork watched me drink with small, red eyes that gleamed with what I initially interpreted as malice, but later realized was curiosity. When I finished and pushed the canteen back through the bars, it made that sound again, a rough, barking exhalation that shook its massive frame. It took me 3 more encounters before I understood that sound was laughter. Not the cruel laughter of a torturer enjoying his victim's pain, but genuine amusement at something it found funny. I never determined what that something was. Perhaps it was the sight of a human Commissar who had once stood before firing squads with absolute authority, reduced to gratefully accepting fouled water from a Zenos creature. Perhaps it was my expression. Perhaps Orks simply found existence itself amusing in ways human psychology could never comprehend. That particular Ork became something like a regular visitor over the following days. Though I hesitate to use terms like regular or visitor as if there were any structure to Ork behavior. It would appear at irregular intervals, sometimes bringing water, sometimes bringing what I could only assume was food, a chunk of some unidentifiable meat, still warm, that I forced myself to eat despite my commissarial dignity screaming against it. Hunger and principle fought a brief war in my stomach, and hunger won decisively. The Ork would watch me eat, make that laughing sound, and then lumber away to attend to whatever mysterious purposes motivated its actions. I began to notice details about this particular greenskin. It was smaller than many of the others, though still far larger than any human, with a collection of mechanical augmentations welded directly to its flesh in ways that should have caused fatal infections, but apparently did not. One arm had been replaced entirely with a crude mechanical limb that sparked whenever it flexed, and there were cables running from its skull into a boxy device strapped to its back that clicked and whirred constantly. I had read intelligence briefings about Ork mechs, their technical caste, if such a term could be applied to creatures with no apparent social organization. They built the ramshackle vehicles and weapons that somehow functioned despite violating every principle of engineering the Mechanicus held sacred. This one seemed to have claimed me as a project, though I could not fathom why. On the 8th day, it brought another Ork to see me. This one was massive, easily twice the size of my mech, with a mechanical claw for one hand and a collection of trophies dangling from its armor that included no fewer than 3 human skulls. I recognized one of them immediately. The distinctive scar across the forehead marked it as Captain Hollis of the 44th's 3rd Company, a man I had stood beside during the defense of Hive Tertius. The sight of his skull, reduced to mere ornamentation on Zenos armor, ignited rage in my chest that momentarily overwhelmed the careful neutrality I had been cultivating. I must have made some sound, some involuntary expression of fury, because both Orks looked at me with renewed interest. The larger one leaned close to my cage, its breath hot and reeking of something like burning rubber mixed with rotted meat. It spoke, and to my shock, I understood approximately half of the words. It was using corrupted Low Gothic, the trade language of the Imperium, filtered through vocal cords never designed for human speech. "Dis da umi what don't die easy?" It rumbled, the words emerging as a series of harsh consonants and drawn-out vowels. The mech nodded enthusiastically, launching into what sounded like an explanation in pure Orcish, all gutturals and aggressive intonation. I caught the word Commissar repeated several times, and realized with a sinking feeling that they knew what I was. They had not captured me at random. They had specifically taken a Commissar. But why? The larger Ork, I would learn later that it was the camp's war boss. The dominant creature that ruled through sheer physical superiority stared at me for a long moment, then made that same laughing bark and walked away. The mech remained, its small red eyes fixed on me with unsettling intensity. It reached into a pouch at its belt and pulled out something that made my blood freeze. My commissarial cap, the peaked black hat that symbolized the authority of the Officio Prefectus. It was filthy, stained with my own blood from when I had been captured, but unmistakable. The mech placed it on its own head, which was far too large for the hat to fit properly, and struck what I can only describe as a pose. Then it pointed at me, pointed at the hat, and made an interrogative grunt. It took me a moment to understand what it was asking. When I did, I felt something crack inside my carefully maintained composure. The creature was asking if the hat made it look like me. It was mimicking, playing. The Orks had not captured me for intelligence or tactical advantage. They had captured me because I was interesting to them, a curiosity, a toy. I had been trained to resist torture, but not irrelevance. The days blurred together after that revelation. The mech visited regularly, always bringing water, occasionally bringing food. It seemed to have appointed itself as my keeper, and none of the other orcs challenged this arrangement, which told me something about orc social hierarchy that I filed away in the part of my mind that was still analyzing, still looking for tactical advantage, still pretending I might escape and return to my regiment. That part of my mind grew smaller with each passing day, but it persisted with the stubborn tenacity that had earned me my commissarial rank in the first place. The mech began bringing objects for me to identify. An Imperial Voxcaster, smashed but recognizable. A lasgun, stripped of its power pack. A primer on Imperial tactics, its pages mostly burned. It would hold up each item and grunt interrogatively, and I found myself responding despite my better judgment. What did I have to lose? Silence would not save me. The orcs already possessed these items and clearly had no idea how to properly use them. Teaching them would be treason. But simply identifying objects seemed harmless enough. I told myself I was gathering information, learning about their capabilities, preparing for the moment when rescue would come. Rescue never came. By the third week, I had accepted that the 44th had either been completely destroyed or had retreated beyond the orc-held territory that surrounded this camp. No Imperial force was coming for a single Commissar. No matter how many executions I had performed in the Emperor's name, I was alone among Zenos, and I would die here, though apparently not soon enough. The mech began speaking to me more frequently, using that broken Gothic that scraped against my ears like metal on stone. It wanted to know about humans. Not tactical information. It showed no interest in military intelligence, but basic facts about human biology, behavior, social structure. Why did humans need so much water? Why did humans stand in lines? Why did humans follow orders from other humans who were not physically larger or stronger? The questions were nonsensical from a proper Imperial perspective, but they revealed something about orc psychology that I found deeply disturbing. They genuinely did not understand hierarchy that was not based on physical dominance. I tried to explain the chain of command, the importance of discipline, the spiritual authority granted by the Emperor's blessing. The mech listened with apparent attention, its mechanical eyepiece clicking and adjusting focus, and then asked why humans would not simply hit their leaders if the leaders were smaller than them. I attempted to explain duty, honor, the complex web of obligations and beliefs that held Imperial society together. The mech considered this for a long moment, then said something that shattered my remaining certainty about the fundamental superiority of human civilization. Sounds like you's all scared of each other, it said, the words emerging slowly as it struggled with the pronunciation. Loic, you's all waitin' for someone to punch ya if you's don't do what you's told. I opened my mouth to refute this characterization, to explain that Imperial discipline was based on faith and duty, not fear. But the words would not come, because somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice asked, what was the difference, really? I had maintained order through threat of execution. Men had followed my commands because they knew I would shoot them if they did not. The commissarial creed was built on the foundation of fear, fear of failure, fear of cowardice, fear of the enemy, and ultimately, fear of the Commissar himself. We did not inspire loyalty through example or leadership. We inspired obedience through calculated terror. The Orcs, by contrast, followed their leaders because those leaders were demonstrably stronger, more successful, more capable of achieving what the Orcs valued. It was brutally simple, but it was also brutally honest. There was no pretense, no elaborate mythology to justify the power structure. The strongest led, the rest followed. And when a leader grew weak, a stronger one replaced him through simple violence. It was barbaric, yes, but it was also transparent in a way that the Imperium's endless hierarchies and Byzantine political machinations never were. I hated myself for thinking such thoughts. I hated the mech for planting them in my mind. But most of all, I hated that I could not formulate a convincing counter-argument. The fourth week brought a change in my circumstances. The war boss returned to my cage, this time accompanied by several other large orcs who I took to be his lieutenants. They engaged in what sounded like a heated debate, all gutturals and aggressive gesturing, while I sat quietly and tried to appear unthreatening. Not that it mattered, I posed no physical threat to any of them, and we all knew it. The debate ended with the war boss making a decisive gesture, and the mech began working on my cage with an array of tools that sparked and ground and occasionally exploded in small bursts of flame. I thought they were going to kill me. Finally, mercifully, they had grown bored with their human curiosity and would end the experiment. I found myself almost relieved. Death held no terror for me. I had seen too much of it, dealt too much of it, to fear it now. What I feared was the continuation of this existence, this gradual erosion of my certainty, this slow revelation that everything I had believed about the superiority of the Imperium's way might be built on foundations of convenient lies. But they did not kill me. Instead, the mech removed one entire wall of my cage, creating an opening large enough for me to crawl through. It stepped back and gestured toward the opening, making that interrogative grunt. I stared at the gap, my mind unable to process what was happening. Was this a test? A cruel joke? Were they going to shoot me as I tried to escape, turn me into sport? The warboss rumbled something in Orcish, and the mech translated into broken Gothic. Boss says yous can walk round. Don't go too far, or dar boys'll crump ya, but yous can walk. I remained frozen, every instinct screaming that this was a trap. The warboss made an impatient sound, reached in with one massive hand, grabbed me by my torn uniform, and simply pulled me out of the cage. He set me down on my feet. I barely came up to his chest, and gave me a light shove that nearly knocked me over. Then he walked away, his lieutenants following, leaving me standing in the open with the mech watching me expectantly. I took a tentative step, then another. Nothing happened. The orcs in the immediate vicinity glanced at me with passing interest, then returned to whatever they had been doing, fighting, building, dismantling, arguing. I was apparently free to move, within limits that were not clearly defined but that I instinctively understood. Too far, and I would be killed. But within the immediate vicinity of the mech's workshop, I could walk. The implications were staggering. They were not keeping me as a prisoner in the traditional sense. They were keeping me as something else. A pet, perhaps, or a tool, or simply an object of ongoing curiosity, like the salvaged Imperial technology the mech was always tinkering with, trying to understand how it worked. I walked. I had no destination, no purpose beyond the simple act of movement after weeks of confinement. My legs trembled from disuse, and I had to stop frequently to rest. But the freedom of motion was intoxicating even in this nightmarish context. I walked through the mech's workshop, past piles of scrap metal and half-assembled war machines, past orcs who paid me no more attention than they would a wandering squig. I walked until my legs gave out, and then I sat on a chunk of corroded Imperial armor plating and stared at the organized chaos around me. It was then that I noticed something that should have been impossible. The orcs were working. Not in the human sense. There was no oversight, no management, no clear division of labor, but they were constructing something massive, a vehicle or weapon of some kind, and they were doing it through what appeared to be instinct rather than planning. One would weld two pieces together seemingly at random. Another would arrive with a different component that somehow fit the gap created. A third would install a massive engine that had no business functioning, but that coughed to life when an orc hammered it with a wrench. There were no blueprints, no instructions, no technical specifications. They simply built, and somehow what they built worked. I had read Mechanicus reports about orc technology, the way it violated fundamental principles of physics and engineering. I had dismissed them as exaggeration, as the Mechanicus's inability to admit that they did not understand something. But watching it happen before my eyes, I realized the reports had been understating the impossibility of what orcs achieved. They should not be able to build functioning technology. Their machines should explode instantly, should fail at first use, should be unable to achieve anything more complex than a club. Yet here they were, constructing what looked like a massive battle wagon with rotating guns and reinforced armor, and somehow it would work. It would work because they believed it would work, because the collective psychic gestalt of their species imposed their expectations onto reality itself. That was when I began to suspect I was going insane, because I found myself understanding how it worked. Not in a technical sense, I was no engineer, but in a conceptual way that felt like revelation. The Orks did not need to understand their technology because they were not bound by the same physical limitations that constrained humanity. They were psychically active in ways that humans were not, creating a field of belief that made their impossible contraptions function. It was not engineering in any proper sense. It was will made manifest through collective unconscious agreement about how reality should work. And I should not have been able to understand that. A loyal Imperial citizen, a Commissar no less, should have found such concepts utterly alien. Yet there I sat on corroded armor, watching Orks work, and I understood. The mech found me there some time later. It sat down beside me, an act that itself was strange, as Orks rarely sat when they could stand, and followed my gaze to the half-completed battle wagon. It made a satisfied sound, almost like a grunt of pride, and said something in Orcish that I did not catch. Then it tried again in Gothic. "You've seen it now, yeah?" it said. "How the stuff works." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say that I saw nothing but Zenos barbarism, that I understood nothing of their primitive technology, that I remained loyal to the Omnissiah and the machine god of Mars. But I was tired of lying, even to myself. Especially to myself. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a confession of treason. "I see it." The mech made that laughing bark again, louder this time, and slapped me on the back with enough force to knock the air from my lungs. When I recovered, gasping, it was grinning at me with a mouth full of square, flat teeth like tombstones. "Told da boss you smart for an Umi," it said. "Yous gets it. Most Umis, they can't see it. They got all this stuff in they heads 'bout how things gotta work a certain way. But yous different. Yous watchin', yous learnin'." I felt something inside me crack further. The mech was right. I was learning. I was adapting to Ork logic, beginning to see the world through their paradigm, and that should have been impossible. Humans and Orks were fundamentally incompatible species. We should not be able to understand each other at any meaningful level. Yet here I was, having what could almost be called a conversation with a creature that by all rights should have been my mortal enemy. The mech stood, offered me a hand up, and when I took it another moment of treason, accepting help from Zenos, it pulled me to my feet with ease. It led me back to my cage, which now stood permanently open, and gestured inside. I crawled in, grateful for the familiar confinement, and the mech wandered off to resume its tinkering. I sat in my cage, which was now less a prison than a shelter, and tried to piece together the shattered fragments of my identity. I was Commissar Marcos Venn. I had served the Emperor for 37 years. I had executed 143 men for cowardice, dereliction, and heresy. I had stood in firing lines and never wavered. I had maintained discipline through fear and absolute certainty in the righteousness of my actions. I was an instrument of the Imperium's will, a tool in the Emperor's hand, a guardian of humanity's survival. But I was also beginning to suspect that I had been a fool. The weeks continued to pass, and I marked them by changes in my own psychology rather than by any external calendar. I noticed when I stopped flinching at Ork voices. I noticed when I began to distinguish individual Orks by their voices and builds, rather than seeing them as an undifferentiated green mass. I noticed when I started to anticipate the mech's arrival each day, actually looking forward to the conversations we had in broken Gothic supplemented by gestures and crude drawings. The mech was teaching me Orcish. Not deliberately, not through structured lessons, but through simple immersion. It would point at objects and speak their Orcish names, then look at me expectantly until I repeated them. Tool, shooter, truck, Daka. The words were harsh and guttural, forcing my throat into shapes it was not designed to make, but I learned them because there was nothing else to do and because part of me, the part that was adapting, surviving, changing, wanted to learn. I began to understand the camp's social structure through observation. The war boss ruled absolutely, but his authority was not totalitarian in the Imperial sense. He led because he was the strongest, the most successful in battle, the most capable of getting what the Orks wanted. His lieutenants were those who had proven themselves in combat, and they competed constantly for status through what could almost be called friendly rivalry. Fights broke out regularly, but they ended quickly and without permanent grudges. An Ork who lost a fight would acknowledge defeat, return to his work, and bear no apparent resentment. An Ork who won would claim his prize, a better weapon, a preferred spot near the fire, first choice of loot, and life would continue. It was brutal, yes, but it was also strangely peaceful in its brutality. There were no political machinations, no whispered conspiracies, no elaborate plots for advancement. You wanted something, you fought for it, you lost, you accepted defeat and tried again later. There was a terrible honesty to it that made the Imperium's baroque social systems seem almost cruel by comparison. I caught myself thinking such thoughts more frequently as the second month of my captivity passed. Each time, I tried to reassert my Imperial conditioning, to remind myself that Orks were Zenos filth that needed to be purged, that the Imperium's way was humanity's only hope for survival. But the mantras rang increasingly hollow. I had seen too much, understood too much. The crack in my certainty had become a chasm, and I was falling through. The mech began taking me with it when it worked on various projects around the camp. I was not required to help. The Orks never required anything from me, but I found myself assisting anyway, handing tools when they were needed, holding components in place while the mech welded them together, offering suggestions that were sometimes ignored and sometimes implemented. I told myself I was gathering intelligence, learning about Ork capabilities so I could report them if I ever escaped. But I knew I was lying. I helped because the alternative was sitting in my cage doing nothing, and because some part of me enjoyed the work in a way I had not enjoyed anything in decades. When was the last time I had built something rather than destroyed it? When was the last time I had created rather than executed? I could not remember. My entire adult life had been dedicated to tearing down, identifying weakness, eliminating failure, culling the unworthy from the Imperial war machine. I had been very good at it, but I had never built anything. I had never made something that did not exist before. The Orks built constantly, tearing apart and reconstructing, destroying and creating in an endless cycle of enthusiastic violence that somehow resulted in progress. There was something liberating about it, and that terrified me more than anything else that had happened. The third month brought the first dream. I was standing in formation with my regiment, preparing to execute a soldier for cowardice. The usual procedure: reading the charges, allowing final words, giving the command to fire. But when I looked at the condemned man's face, it was my own. I stared at myself, seeing the fear in my own eyes, and I gave the order anyway. The firing squad raised their lasguns, and I woke before the shots were fired, my heart hammering, my breath coming in gasps. The mech found me like that, trembling in my cage in the pre-dawn darkness. It said nothing, just sat beside the cage and waited until my breathing normalized. When I finally looked at it, expecting mockery or curiosity, I saw something I had never expected to see in an Ork's face, something that might have been concern. It reached through the bars and patted my shoulder with its mechanical hand, the metal fingers cold against my skin, and made a low rumbling sound that was probably meant to be comforting. "You's all right, Commissar," it said quietly. "You's safe here." The absurdity of the statement nearly broke me. Safe. I was safe among Orks, protected by Zenos from my own nightmares. The laugh that escaped me was not healthy, but the mech did not seem disturbed by it. It just kept patting my shoulder until I quieted, then wandered off to begin its daily work. I did not return to sleep. Instead, I sat in my cage and confronted the truth I had been avoiding. I did not want to be rescued. The thought of returning to the Imperium, of resuming my duties as a commissar, of standing before firing squads and reading charges and giving execution orders, it filled me with a horror deeper than anything the Orks had inflicted. Because now I understood what I had been doing. Now I saw the system I had served not as humanity's necessary defense, but as humanity's endless self-consumption, a machine that devoured its own people in the name of survival until the distinction between survival and extinction became meaningless. The Orks did not do that. They fought, yes. They were violent, destructive, single-minded in their pursuit of warfare. But they did not turn on themselves. They did not execute their own for failing to be brave enough, strong enough, faithful enough. They accepted what each Ork was and slotted him into the position where he could contribute best. A weak Ork became a Gretchen handler. A clever Ork became a mech. A strong Ork became a warrior. There was no shame in being what you were, only in failing to be it as well as you could. I had spent 37 years enforcing a system that demanded everyone be what they were not, that punished natural human fear and weakness and doubt, that required superhuman faith in a half-dead god-emperor who had not spoken in 10,000 years. And I had called that civilization. I had called that humanity's best hope. What did that make me? The answer came slowly, over days of observation and contemplation. Complicit. I had been complicit in humanity's self-destruction, and I had been too certain of my righteousness to see it. The Orks, in their brutal simplicity, had torn away the comfortable lies I had wrapped around myself like armor, and underneath I found only emptiness and accumulated guilt. The 4th month marked a turning point. The war boss called a gathering a WAAGAGH meeting. I learned later where the entire camp assembled to hear his plans for the next offensive. I was not required to attend, but I went anyway. Standing at the edge of the crowd of greenskins and watching as the war boss outlined his strategy using crude diagrams drawn in the dirt with a stick. The plan was simple to the point of absurdity. Drive straight at the nearest Imperial fortification, smash through the gates, kill everything inside, take all the good stuff. No subtlety, no deception, no complex tactical maneuvering, just pure, direct violence, applied with overwhelming force. It would work. I knew it would work because I understood now how Orks fought. They did not need complex tactics because they had something better. Absolute commitment to the fight itself. Every Ork would charge with full enthusiasm. No one would retreat or falter, and the sheer weight of their assault would carry them through. The Imperial defenders would try to hold discipline, would try to maintain formation, would try to follow the tactical doctrine that had been drummed into them through decades of training. And they would fail because they were fighting individually while the Orks were fighting as a gestalt, a collective organism that shared determination and momentum through their psychic field. I should have felt horror at this realization. I should have been planning how to warn my former comrades, how to sabotage the Ork attack, how to redeem myself through one final act of service to the Emperor. Instead, I felt nothing. The soldiers in that fortification would die, and it would make no difference. New soldiers would be shipped in to replace them, and they would die too. And the cycle would continue until humanity finally consumed itself completely, or until something else destroyed us first. I had spent decades feeding bodies into that machine, and I was tired, so very tired. The mech found me after the meeting ended, its mechanical eye gleaming with excitement about the upcoming battle. It would be building special weapons for the assault, it explained in its broken Gothic, big shooters and bombs that would crack open the Imperial bunkers like nuts. Did I want to help? I should have refused. I should have resisted. I should have maintained some shred of loyalty to the Imperium that had shaped me. But I heard myself saying yes, and I meant it. Not because I wanted to betray humanity, I was beyond such dramatic gestures, but because helping the mech build weapons was at least doing something concrete in a universe where everything else felt meaningless. The Emperor would not care whether I lived or died. The Imperium would not care. My former comrades would not care. But the mech cared whether I handed it the right tool at the right moment. And that small, immediate purpose was more real than any abstract loyalty to a 10,000-year-old corpse on a throne of gold. So I helped. I handed tools, I held components, I even suggested modifications based on my knowledge of Imperial armor weaknesses. The mech listened to my suggestions with apparent respect, sometimes implementing them, sometimes explaining why they would not work in Orcish terms I was learning to understand. We worked together for days, building weapons that would kill Imperial soldiers, and I felt no guilt. The absence of guilt should have terrified me, but it did not. I was beyond terror now, floating in a calm acceptance of my own treason. The night before the assault, the war boss came to see me again. The mech had apparently been talking about my contributions, because the war boss regarded me with something approaching respect, insofar as an orc could respect something as small and weak as a human. It spoke in Gothic, the words coming more easily than they had months earlier, suggesting that it had been practicing. "You's fought for da, Umi boss, yeah?" It rumbled. "You's made Yuva, Umis do what you wanted?" "Yes," I said. There was no point in lying. "But yous don't want to go back to da Umis?" I opened my mouth to protest that of course I wanted to return to my regiment, that I was loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium, that I would escape at the first opportunity. But the words would not come, because they were lies, and I was done with lies. I had built my entire life on lies, lies about duty, about faith, about the righteousness of the Imperium's endless war. I could not maintain them anymore. "No," I said quietly. "I don't want to go back." The war boss made that laughing bark sound, louder than I had ever heard it, and the sound rippled through the assembled orcs like a wave. They all laughed. A collective roar of approval that should have been mocking but somehow was not. The war boss reached out with one massive hand and grabbed my shoulder, not roughly, but firmly, and spoke a single word in Orcish that I had learned weeks ago. "Ours." Then it released me and walked away. And I understood that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer a prisoner. I was not free. Freedom was a human concept that meant nothing in Orc society, but I was no longer an outsider. I had been accepted, incorporated, made part of the WAAGH in some way I could not fully articulate. The Orcs had no formal ritual for this, no ceremony or oath. They simply decided I was one of them now, in whatever limited capacity a human could be one of them, and that was that. The assault the next day was everything I had predicted. The Orcs surged forward in a green tide. Shooters blazing, choppers swinging, war cries shaking the air. The Imperial defenders held for approximately 17 minutes before their line broke and the slaughter began. I watched from the back of the mech's truck, which had been designated as our position during the battle. I was not required to fight. I had no weapon, no training in Orc combat tactics, and I would have been killed instantly, but I watched, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction at Orc victory, not horror at Imperial defeat, just a hollow emptiness where my emotions should have been. Some of the defenders surrendered. This surprised me, as I would have shot any man in my regiment who tried to surrender to Zenos. But these were different times, different circumstances, and the soldiers who threw down their weapons and raised their hands apparently hoped for mercy. They did not receive it, of course. Orcs did not take prisoners, with the single bizarre exception of commissars. Apparently, the surrendering soldiers were killed quickly, at least, which was more mercy than they would have received from a commissar executing them for cowardice. The Orcs looted the fortification with enthusiastic efficiency, taking everything that was not nailed down and several things that were. Weapons, ammunition, armor, vehicles, supplies, all of it disappeared into the Orc war machine, where it would be repurposed and rebuilt into something that should not work but would. The mech was particularly excited about capturing several Imperial heavy weapons, which it immediately began dismantling to understand how they functioned. I helped with this process, explaining the principles behind lascannon focusing arrays and autocannon feeding mechanisms, and the mech listened carefully, incorporating my knowledge into its own instinctive understanding of how weapons should work. We worked through the night, And when dawn came, I realized I had not thought about my former regiment once. I had not wondered if any of the defenders had been men I knew, if any of the dead might have been former comrades. They were simply bodies now, resources to be processed by the Orc war machine, and I could not bring myself to care. Something inside me had died during the assault, some final connection to my former identity, and I felt lighter for its absence. The months that followed settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible when I was first captured. I became the mech's permanent assistant, helping with projects, translating Imperial technical manuals that the Orcs had looted, explaining human psychology and tactics when asked. The other Orcs accepted my presence with the same casual indifference they showed toward Gretchen's. I was small, weak, and useful in specific ways, so I had a place in their hierarchy. No one questioned it. No one cared. I learned Orcish with increasing fluency, the harsh language becoming natural in my mouth. I learned to understand Orc humor, their casual violence, their simple joy in existence. I learned that they did not hate humanity the way humanity hated them. We were simply enemies because fighting was what Orcs did, and humans were good opponents because we fought back. There was no malice in it, no ideological hatred, no sense of moral superiority. Just simple, honest violence with no deeper meaning required. I began to think like them, and that was when I truly understood that I was lost. Not lost in the sense of being physically separated from my regiment that had happened the moment I was captured. Lost in the sense of having no desire to be found. The person I had been, Commissar Marcos Venn of the Hadrian 44th, had died in that cage. What remained was something else. Something that had no name in either Gothic or Orcish, something that existed in the liminal space between human and Zenos. The dreams of executing myself stopped. They were replaced by dreams of standing before the Golden Throne, watching the Emperor's corpse and asking him a simple question. Why? Why this endless war? Why this eternal suffering? Why build an Imperium that devoured its own people? In the dreams, the Emperor never answered. He just sat there, dead or alive or something in between, while humanity screamed itself into extinction around him. I woke from these dreams not terrified but calm, because I knew I had escaped. I had found my way out of the machine, even if the exit was through the hands of creatures I had been taught to hate. The Orcs had not tortured me, had not broken me through physical suffering. They had simply existed around me, being what they were without pretense or apology, until I could no longer maintain the pretense of what I was supposed to be. The 6th month brought traders, other Orc clans arriving with loot to exchange, fighters to test themselves against our warboss, mechs to share techniques and argue about which weapons were best. I was a curiosity to these visitors, and they would often stop by the mech's workshop to stare at me and ask questions in Orcish. I now understood. Why was there a human here? Why had we not killed it? What was it for? The mech's answer was always the same. This one's smart. Knows things. Useful, yeah? And the other Orcs would nod, accepting this explanation, and move on. Some would try to trade for me, offering weapons or scrap, or even other slaves they had captured, though those slaves were almost always killed within days because they fought back or tried to escape, or could not accept their situation. I made no attempt to escape. Where would I go? Back to the Imperium that had taught me to be a monster in the Emperor's name. Back to a life of executions and manufactured certainty. I was damaged goods now, tainted by prolonged contact with Zenos, and even if I somehow returned to Imperial lines, I would likely be executed as a heretic or, at best, mind-wiped and turned into a servitor. Better to stay where I was useful. Better to stay where I was accepted, however strange that acceptance might be. The 7th month brought a realization that should have shattered me, but instead brought an odd peace. I was no longer pretending to be imprisoned. I was genuinely content. Not happy the Orcs did not do happiness in any human sense, but content in my work, in my purpose, in the simple existence of building and learning and surviving. I had food, shelter, and work that challenged me. I had conversations with the mech about topics ranging from weapons design to human psychology to the nature of belief. I had a place in the hierarchy, however strange that place might be. I had more than I had ever had as a commissar. A commissar was a tool, disposable and interchangeable. A commissar existed to be hated, to enforce discipline through fear, to stand alone and apart from the men he commanded. A commissar had no friends, no real comrades, no one who valued him for anything except his willingness to execute others. I had been proud of that loneliness once, had worn it like armor, had convinced myself that such isolation was noble sacrifice for the Emperor's glory. But it had been lie. Just one more lie in the mountain of lies that constituted Imperial ideology. The mech valued me because I was useful and interesting. The war boss tolerated me because I caused no trouble and contributed to the clan's success. The other Orks accepted me because their society was simple enough to accommodate anomalies without breaking. It was not friendship in any human sense. Orks did not do friendship the way humans did, but it was acceptance, and that was more than I had ever received from the Imperium I had served. The 8th month brought the reckoning I had been unconsciously expecting. An Imperial force, larger than any we had yet faced, launched a coordinated assault on our territory. The war boss called a full WAAGH, summoning every available Ork to the defense. This was serious. I understood from the preparations, not serious in the sense that the Orks were worried, because Orks did not worry, but serious in the sense that this fight would be bigger, longer, and more violent than the usual skirmishes. The mech included me in his preparations as a matter of course, asking my opinion on weapon placements, fortification design, probable Imperial tactics. I gave my analysis freely, drawing on decades of military experience to predict how the assault would unfold. The mech listened, implemented some suggestions, ignored others based on Orcish tactical logic I was learning to understand, and thanked me for my help in its casual way. "You's good at this, Commissar," it said, as we finished reinforcing the workshop's walls with salvaged Imperial armor plating. "You's thinkin' like an Ork now." The statement should have horrified me. Instead, I felt something like pride, because the mech was right. I was thinking like an Ork, not completely. My human psychology was too deeply ingrained for that, but enough to understand their tactical logic, their simple but effective approach to warfare, their focus on momentum and morale over complex maneuvering. I had become something hybrid, neither fully human nor acceptably Orcish, existing in a space between species that probably should not exist. The assault began at dawn, Imperial artillery hammering our position with systematic precision. The Orks responded with their usual enthusiasm, firing back with weapons that should have exploded but did not, charging forward when any sane soldier would have taken cover, laughing as they fought. I stayed in the mech's workshop, having no illusions about my capacity to contribute to actual combat, and watched the battle unfold through the reinforced observation slit we had installed. The Imperial force was competent, well-led, and numerous. Under normal circumstances, they might have actually succeeded in routing the Orks through superior tactics and discipline, but these were not normal circumstances, because the Orks were not a normal enemy. The Imperial commanders kept trying to outmaneuver the greenskin forces, to exploit gaps in the Ork lines, to apply pressure on weak points. The problem was that Orks did not have weak points in any traditional sense. Every Ork was equally willing to charge into certain death if it meant getting into combat, which meant that conventional tactics designed to exploit fear and self-preservation simply did not work. The battle lasted 3 days. By the end, the Imperial force had been scattered, its vehicles destroyed or captured, its survivors fleeing into the wasteland, where they would likely die of exposure or be hunted down by roaming Ork bands. The war boss was jubilant, having personally killed the Imperial commander in single combat, an act that he recounted with such enthusiastic detail that even I, accustomed to violence, found it slightly excessive. But there was a casualty on our side that mattered, at least to me. The mech had been wounded, taking a direct hit from a plasma gun that had melted through its mechanical arm and into its torso. It was alive. Orcs were insanely difficult to kill, but it was hurt badly enough that it could not work on its usual projects. I found myself taking over many of its duties without being asked. Directing Gretchens to salvage specific components, making basic repairs to damaged equipment, organizing the workshop's inventory. The other orcs accepted this naturally, as if there were nothing strange about a human running a mech's workshop in the mech's absence. When the mech recovered enough to return to work, it found me installing a new targeting system on one of the trucks. It watched in silence for several minutes, then made that laughing bark that I now understood to be approval. "You's learned good, Commissar," it said, using the title that had become more nickname than rank. "You's almost a proper mech now." Almost, not quite, because I was human, and there were limits to how much I could understand Orc technology without the psychic connection they all shared. But almost was enough. Almost meant I had a place, a purpose, a reason to continue existing in this strange life I had built from the ruins of my former certainty. The months continued to accumulate, and I stopped counting them. Time became fluid, measured by battles and projects rather than calendar days. I learned to repair Orc vehicles, to maintain their weapons, to design modifications that improved functionality, without violating the fundamental Orcish principle that things should be violent, loud, and somewhat unstable. I became, against all probability, good at it. Not as good as a real mech, but competent enough to be useful. I also began to change physically, though I did not notice at first. The Orc diet, such as it was slowly altering my metabolism. The constant exposure to Orc spores, the microscopic fungal particles that filled the air around any Orc settlement, was having effects that I only gradually recognized. My skin was toughening, developing a slightly greenish tint that I initially dismissed as lighting but eventually accepted as real. My strength was increasing, my reflexes improving, my senses sharpening. I was not becoming an Orc that was biologically impossible, but I was being altered by proximity to them, by breathing their air and eating their food and living in their gestalt field. I should have been terrified by this transformation. I should have fought against it, tried to preserve my human biology against Zenos contamination. But I felt only curiosity. What would I become? How far could human biology adapt to Orcish influence? Would I eventually reach some limit, or would the changes continue until I was something unprecedented, a hybrid that should not exist? The answers came slowly, over what I estimated to be another year, though I had lost the ability to track time precisely. My body continued to change, growing stronger and more resilient, but retaining its fundamentally human architecture. I was not becoming an Orc. I was becoming something else. Something that had no name in any language, because nothing like it had existed before. A human shaped by prolonged exposure to the Orc gestalt field, altered at a fundamental biological level by breathing their spores, changed psychologically by accepting their worldview. I was, in the most literal sense, no longer human. But I was not Zenos either. I existed in the space between, a living violation of the Imperium's categorical certainties about the fundamental incompatibility of human and alien, and I was content with that. The realization came gradually, without drama or revelation. I was working on a particularly complex weapons system, trying to integrate Imperial targeting technology with Orc firing mechanisms, when I caught my reflection in a piece of polished metal. I barely recognized myself. My skin had the greenish tint of someone who had spent too long around Orcs. My eyes had taken on a reddish cast. My teeth, I ran my tongue over them, experimentally, were slightly sharper than they should have been. I looked like something that had crawled out of an inquisitor's nightmare, a human so thoroughly corrupted by Zenos contact that redemption was impossible. I should have felt horror. I felt relief, because I was finally free of the burden of being Commissar Marcos Ven, faithful servant of the Emperor, enforcer of Imperial discipline, executioner of the weak and doubtful. That person was dead, transformed so thoroughly that not even a mind wipe could restore what he had been. I was something new now, something that had no place in the Imperium's rigid categories, but that fit perfectly into the chaotic flexibility of Orc society. The mech found me staring at my reflection, and it made a satisfied grunt. "You's changed good," it said approvingly. "Almost proper now. Almost." That word again. I would never be truly Orcish. My biology was too different, my psychology too fundamentally human despite all the changes. But almost was enough. Almost meant acceptance. Almost meant I had found a place in a universe that had tried to crush me into a role I could no longer maintain. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. "I have changed." The mech laughed, that same barking sound I had learned to associate with approval, and clapped me on the shoulder with its mechanical hand. The impact would have knocked me down a year ago. Now I barely swayed, my Orc-altered physiology absorbing the force easily. "Good," the mech said. "Now get back to work. Dat targeting system ain't gonna install itself." I got back to work, and I realized something that should have been devastating, but instead brought a strange peace. I would never leave this place. Not because I was imprisoned, my cage had stood open and unused for months, but because I had nowhere else to go. The Imperium would execute me on sight if they understood what I had become. The Orcs accepted me not despite my transformation, but because of it. This was my home now, this ramshackle camp full of creatures that should have been my mortal enemies but instead were simply my clan, my WAAGA. The thought should have been treason. Instead, it was simple truth. I belong to the WAAGAGH now, as much as any Gretchen or boy or knob. I contributed to its success, benefited from its protection, shared in its victories and defeats. I was part of the collective Gestalt, a tiny human node in the vast psychic network that connected all Orcs and, apparently, those who lived long enough in their presence. I could feel it sometimes, late at night, when the camp was as quiet as it ever got, a pressure at the back of my mind, a sense of connection to the other Orcs, a dim awareness of their simple, uncomplicated emotions, joy in violence, pride in strength, satisfaction in building, anger at enemies. I was not fully part of the Gestalt. My human psychology prevented total integration, but I was touching it, receiving whispers of what the Orcs shared constantly and completely. And it was wonderful. Not in any human sense of wonderful. It was not beautiful or peaceful or morally uplifting, but it was real. It was honest. It was a connection based on genuine shared experience rather than enforced belief. The Orcs did not need to be taught loyalty through fear. They did not need to be threatened into obedience. They simply were what they were, and the Gestalt emerged naturally from the sum of what they all believed and desired. That was what the Imperium lacked, I realized. Not strength or technology or even faith. The Imperium had all those things in abundance. What it lacked was honesty. Every relationship in Imperial society was built on lies, lies about duty, about faith, about the Emperor's will, about the necessity of endless war. We told ourselves we fought for humanity's survival, but what we were really doing was feeding humanity into a 10,000-year-old machine that existed primarily to perpetuate its own existence. The Orcs fought because they enjoyed fighting. Simple, honest, true. I had spent my entire adult life enforcing lies, and I had called it service. The Orcs had freed me from that burden, not through any deliberate act of liberation, but simply by being so fundamentally themselves that all my careful lies collapsed under the weight of their authentic existence. Years passed. I think they were years. Though time had become meaningless in any precise sense. I continued to work with the mech, continued to help build weapons and vehicles for the WAAGH, continued to change in ways both physical and psychological. My greenish skin darkened, my strength continued to increase. My integration with the Gestalt field deepened, until I could sense the emotional state of nearby Orcs without conscious thought. I learned to fight, eventually. Not well. I would never have an Orc's sheer physical prowess, but well enough to defend myself when minor disputes turned violent, which they did regularly. I learned to laugh at injury, to view pain as temporary inconvenience rather than existential threat. I learned to find joy in simple violence, to appreciate the aesthetic beauty of a well-executed charge or precisely timed explosion. I became, in all meaningful senses, Orc. Not biologically, I remained fundamentally human in my DNA, however much that DNA had been altered by spore exposure and gestalt field influence. But psychologically, socially, emotionally, I was Orc. I thought like them, acted like them, valued what they valued. My human past became increasingly distant, a half-remembered dream that had happened to someone else. Commissar Marcos Venn was dead. I was something else now, something that had no name because nothing like me had existed before. A human who had been adopted by Orcs, transformed by them, made into a bridge between species that should have remained eternally separate. And I was content. The war boss called another WAAGH meeting, bigger than any before. He had been contacted by a massive Orc fleet passing through the system, led by a war boss so powerful that even our boss spoke of him with something approaching awe. This was a major WAAGAG, a gathering of clans that happened only when something truly significant was planned. We were being invited to join. The target, I learned from conversations in broken Gothic and increasingly fluent Orcish, was a major Imperial hive world. The kind of target that would normally be suicidal to assault, but with the combined force of multiple clans, with the psychic momentum of a true WAAGH behind them, the Orcs believed they could crack open the hive's defenses and loot its treasures. They were probably right. Orcs were always right, in their way, because their belief made reality conform to their expectations. The mech asked me if I wanted to come along. It was phrased as a question, but I understood it was really an invitation to fully commit to what I had become. If I stayed behind, I would remain in the camp, continue my work, exist in a kind of comfortable limbo. If I went, I would be participating directly in the destruction of human civilization, crossing a line from passive acceptance of my situation to active collaboration with humanity's enemies. I should have refused. Some shred of loyalty should have remained, some fragment of my commissarial conditioning that would prevent me from actually helping to destroy an imperial world. But when I searched inside myself for that loyalty, I found only emptiness where it should have been. The Imperium that had shaped me no longer had any claim on my allegiance. I had seen both sides now, lived in both worlds, and I knew which one had treated me with more honesty. "Yes," I said, "I'll come." The mech's mechanical eye gleamed with what might have been pleasure, and it clapped me on the shoulder with enough force to stagger me. "Good. Use proper now. Commissar, use one of Dar boys, one of the boys. The highest honor an Orc could give to someone not of their species, recognition that I belonged, that I was part of the WAAGH, that I had earned my place through work and time and transformation. I should have been horrified. I should have felt the weight of treason crushing my soul. Instead, I felt pride. We loaded onto the transports that would take us to the fleet, and I looked back at the camp that had been my home for what I estimated was 3 years, possibly more. The cage where I had first been kept still stood, its door permanently open, a monument to the person I had been when I arrived. That person was dead now, executed not by Orc violence but by Orc acceptance, by the simple act of being welcomed into a society that should have been incompatible with human existence. As the transport lifted off, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the metal hull. I barely looked human anymore. My skin was distinctly green, my eyes completely red, my build thicker and more muscular than any human could naturally achieve. I looked like something that should not exist, a violation of the natural order, a crime against both human and Orc biology. I looked perfect. The fleet was massive, ships cobbled together from 1,000 different hulls, held together by Orc engineering that should not work but did because they believed it would. We joined the formation, and I felt the gestalt field strengthen. Thousands of Orcs all focused on the same goal, all sharing the same simple desire: to fight, to win, to take what they wanted. The psychic pressure was overwhelming, intoxicating, filling me with a certainty I had not felt since my first days as a Commissar, before doubt and experience had worn away my faith. But this certainty was different. It was not based on lies about the Emperor's will or humanity's manifest destiny. It was based on the simple, honest truth that we were strong, we were ready, and we would win because we believed we would win, and that belief had power in ways the Imperium refused to acknowledge. The journey took weeks, and during that time I worked alongside the mech, preparing weapons and vehicles for the assault. I translated Imperial defense protocols I remembered from my commissarial training, explaining weak points in hive defenses, suggesting optimal attack vectors. I was committing treason with every word, and I felt no guilt. The soldiers defending that hive were strangers to me now, abstract figures representing a civilization I no longer belonged to. When we reached the target world and began the descent, I stood on the deck of the mech's transport and watched the hive cities grow larger below us. Massive structures housing billions of humans, all living their lives in service to the Emperor, all caught in the same machine of lies and fear that had consumed my own life for 3 decades. I should have felt kinship with them, should have wanted to warn them, to save them from the violence that was coming. I felt nothing. The assault began at dawn, thousands of Orks streaming from their transports in a green wave of joyful violence. I stayed with the mech, operating the weapon systems I had helped design, targeting Imperial defenses with precision born of decades of military experience. I watched humans die through my targeting scope, saw soldiers in uniforms not unlike the one I had once worn cut down by weapons I had helped build, and I felt only satisfaction that the systems I had designed were working correctly. Commissar Marcos Ven would have been horrified by what I had become, but Commissar Marcos Ven was dead, and I was something else now. Something that belonged to the WAAG, something that had been freed from the burden of human civilization by the simple act of being accepted by creatures who should have been my mortal enemies. The battle raged for days, and eventually, inevitably, the Imperial defenses broke. The Orks poured into the hive, and the looting began. I helped the mech identify valuable technology, explaining what each device did and how it could be repurposed. I was useful, I had purpose, I belonged, and I was content. That is what happens when Orks capture a commissar. Not torture, not death, not even corruption in any traditional sense. Something worse. Acceptance. They accept you into their society, until you forget why you ever wanted to leave. They reshape you through simple exposure, until you understand that their brutal honesty is better than humanity's elaborate lies. They offer you a place in the WAAG age, and eventually, you take it. Because the alternative is returning to a civilization built on fear and maintained through endless self-consumption. And once you have seen both sides, that return becomes impossible. I am no longer human. I am no longer Commissar. I am something that should not exist. A bridge between species, a living violation of the Imperium's certainty about the fundamental separation between human and Zenos, and I have never been more free.